Today's event is creating a fulfilling workplace that drives productivity, engagement, and innovation. Now, this is a challenge faced by leaders in every industry. For many, the prospect of building or changing organizational culture feels overwhelming, an abstract task with no clear roadmap. What if I told you that this process could be as structured and intentional as any other major project that your business undertakes? In fact, establishing a fulfilling and productive culture can and should be approached like a project, complete with clear objectives, actionable steps, and measurable milestones. The secret lies in aligning the practices within your organization to meet fundamental human needs, building on intrinsic motivation, and leveraging proven frameworks like self-determination theory and the 6 human needs. After all, an organization is made up of people, and those people have needs, both implicit and explicit. The next agreement says that people are going to get those needs met with the organization or without it. They're going to get the needs met whether it's aligned or not. This is going to be done. So not meeting those needs is like playing whack-a-mole. As you reflect on what it takes to build an extraordinary culture, consider the lessons from Jim Collins' work, Good to Great and Great by Choice. Collins found that the leaders of exceptional companies shared a distinctive approach that he termed Level 5 leadership. These leaders combined personal humility with intense professional will to achieve sustained success. Their ability to create lasting impact was rooted in their focus on doing what was right, not what was easy, and in setting up their organizations for long-term success. Dynamic leadership paired with intentional development plans provides a practical roadmap to foster Level 5 leadership for those who are committed to excellence. But what if you feel limited by your environment? Maybe you feel your hands are tied by external factors like government regulations, resource constraints, or industry standards. Let me offer you another perspective. Think about professional sports teams. They operate under rigid rules. They face external oversight from referees and live with intense scrutiny from the press, fans, and opponents. Yet, they consistently perform at a high level. Why? Because they master the fundamentals of their game. They follow a shared playbook and intentionally develop players to succeed within the rules. Just as a coach doesn't waste time complaining about referees, a great leader focuses on designing strategies and developing talent to perform in any environment. The parallels between sports teams and high-performing organizations are striking. Like a team, your organization thrives when everyone knows the plays, understands their roles, and consistently brings their best to the field. Development plans make up the organizational equivalent of a playbook with the knowledge, skills, and mindset needed to contribute to the team's success. And just like a sports team has a process for onboarding rookies and elevating captains, a development plan ensures new employees integrate seamlessly while leaders progress toward mastery. Intentional development plans not only accelerate personal and professional growth, but also lay the foundation for a thriving culture. When crafted thoughtfully, these plans align with the principles of self-determination theory. They enhance autonomy by helping individuals understand their roles and make decisions confidently. They strengthen competence by providing opportunities for skill building and mastery. And they foster relatedness by reinforcing collaboration and shared purpose. Simultaneously, they address the 6 human needs, particularly growth and contribution, which are essential for fulfillment and motivation in the workplace. For every leader who feels helpless in shaping culture, I want to emphasize this point. Culture is not static. It can be intentionally designed, just as any project can be. Yet it requires time, effort, and consistent commitment. But like any major change initiative, it begins with small, deliberate steps. Think about the flywheel effect, the significant momentum that builds over time with consistent effort. Similarly, a fulfilling workplace takes shape as leaders and employees align their actions with the organization's mission, values, and culture. Dynamic leadership is the flexible approach that can enable this transformation. It helps leaders navigate complexity while providing a structured framework to drive progress. Development plans, as part of this approach, become the roadmap detailing the milestones and best practices necessary to achieve desired outcomes. They not only ensure that new employees understand how to thrive within the culture, but also empower leaders to exemplify level 5 leadership traits, becoming the catalysts for organizational excellence. Remember, if needed, baby steps are still progress. The ultimate goal is clear: to create a workplace where individuals are motivated to grow and contribute at their highest potential. This doesn't happen by chance. It happens by design. Just like a sports team builds its success through intentionality, discipline, and alignment, your organization can do the same. It starts with a vision, followed by a commitment to development and a belief in the power of small, consistent actions to drive big change. Over the next few months, I'll address different aspects of this narrative, culminating in a view of building blocks that owners can follow to establish dynamic leadership in their organizations. I want to take a look at the second agreement today, that people spend more than half their waking hours at work. A good portion of the other half is devoted to gearing up and winding down, commuting, preparation, etc. With so much of a person's life spent working in the organization or for the organization, you can see how simple things like sending a person into fight or flight or forcing them to work too hard to get their intrinsic needs met can wreak havoc on the success of an organization. I'm going to start with a simple example of the neurobiology associated with fight or flight. If any of this seems off, I encourage you to go back and watch last week's live event. It's still up, and it's dealing with the fact that we have a brain that's 100,000 years old. And the point was, why does that matter? Well, it matters because we don't need new ideas or new practices. What we need to do is get good at what works. We already know how human nature is because the philosophers had it mostly right in the last few centuries. And the New Thought era certainly spelled it out well. The difference is that they didn't have the measurement and scanning tools to understand what was really the difference between the subconscious and the conscious mind. And so that part of it requires some clarification, but the essence of it is correct. So if books like Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, it's still true today. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He talked about the 6 human needs in the early 1900s and Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the middle of the 20th century. These things are still valid. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. What we have to do is get good at what works, and we have to understand what works. So I want to use an example of the process of when a person goes into fight or flight. We have to understand that fight or flight, it's an association. It's something that's happening right now is associated with a threat from the past, and as a result, we build up some cortisol. That cortisol prepares us for the adrenaline that's going to flow. And next thing you know, we're at a heightened alert to be able to either run or fight the proverbial Serengeti tiger. Now, this made a lot of sense in a hunter-gatherer environment where what you learn from 0 to 7, which is where most of our conditioning happens, and we're highly susceptible to myelination during that time, which is why those habits get so deeply ingrained. So the threshold for myelination is low and the magnitude of myelination is high. So that's why you have all the conditioning happening from that, or most of it from that 0 to 7. And then the prefrontal cortex from about age 19 to 27, the way I look at it sort of operationalizes all of that. The 20 billion or so neurons that are in the prefrontal cortex were not fully developed until that 19 to 27. And as they develop, they're looking at all the conditioning from life and building the model of the world. Again, that made a lot of sense in a hunter-gatherer environment. Even several hundred years ago in an agricultural environment, it still made sense because the world we were living in at 50 years old was very similar to the world we lived in from 0 to 7. And so the farming techniques and the dealing with the threats and weather and all those things, it still made sense. But today, with the VUCA that's around us, it's constantly changing. Geopolitical events, the global things that happen halfway around the world can impact us. All of this creates a situation where we're constantly being thrown into the unfamiliar. And whereas habit is great. How we're wired and set up, it made a lot of sense for the hunter-gatherer. It made a lot of sense during agriculture time. But today, because the unfamiliar is seen as a threat, it's understandable why people are on edge so much. It's like we're being faced with all this uncertainty. As I was saying, things can happen halfway around the world and have an impact on us almost immediately. Certainly, if not a direct impact, it's taking up attention units. And as we give up attention units, we are then primed for fight or flight. Even our posture, even walking around in a defeated posture, can prime us for a stress response, and the stress response leads to fight or flight. So these things are all coming together. Now dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are part of the process of neuroplasticity, and neuroplasticity is how the habits form, but it's also how the neurons transmit information to the other neurons. So I mentioned myelin, and myelin wraps around the neural pathways that are most often used. I talk about deep practice, that's in last week's as well. Deep practice and struggle on the edge of ability builds up myelin, and that myelin makes the neural pathway very strong. But what's not strong or not enduring is the neurotransmitter in between, the synapse. This moves around based on which neural pathways are being used. So the neural pathway is strong because of the myelin for those that are used, but the neurotransmitter can be shifted. And that's why we talk about habit replacement versus habit change. It's much easier to add a new habit and let that one work the other one out because the synapse moves over to the one that's active. That's a simple way of saying it. However, if you think about dopamine, now dopamine is powerful enough that it caused our hunter-gatherer ancestors to go out and hunt and gather, knowing that there were threats out there, knowing that there were animals that could eat them. But yet they still went because the satisfaction that comes with the dopamine, the reward that comes with the dopamine is so strong that it gets us to overcome those fears and concerns. There's a study that they used rats in a cage, and the way the rats they could go across these tiles to the other side of the cage and flip a lever. And when they flipped the lever, they got a hit of dopamine, and then they would have to go back on the other side. This is a cruel research experiment, in my opinion, but what they would do is electrify the tiles, and as the rat went across, it would have to run faster and faster because the tiles were electrified, but it was worth it to pull that lever and get the dopamine. It got to the point where the rats would do this until they couldn't walk anymore. They would literally burn their feet off until they couldn't walk anymore. And if you think about how dopamine works, it's not just that it happens, it's the anticipation. So this is why addictions happen. It's the anticipation that it's going to come, and then people can only think about that. It's like that's all they want to think about is, in the case of the rats, getting across there, and they can't think about anything else because the dopamine is so strong, and then they do it and it's reinforced. You can apply the same principles in the workplace, which is why I'm talking about this. And at the same time, I'll use an example of how we can inadvertently work against ourselves. The next one I want to talk about is serotonin. I call serotonin the one-up neurotransmitter. This is not a neuroscience conversation, but what I'm saying is aligned with what the neuroscientists show in their research. When a bully bullies someone, their serotonin goes up. The victim serotonin goes down. So I call it the one-up neurotransmitter. There's a particular study where they took an alpha gorilla and put it into this room with some mirrors. And the alpha gorilla was accustomed to, when he showed up, everyone would kowtow to him. They would, the sycophant behavior, right? What they did, though, in this room with mirrors, the alpha gorilla could see the smaller ones, but they couldn't see him. And so he shows up and he's expecting them to do their normal behavior, come over and groom him and these things. And they didn't. They didn't even respond. He starts beating his chest, starts jumping around, trying to get their attention. And he literally worked himself into a frenzy and then into a depression because he wasn't getting the serotonin boost that he was accustomed to. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, but you can just look at that and see how behavior can get reinforced because the person needs a serotonin hit. But you can also see how other people can go into avoidance behavior to avoid a drop in their serotonin. And that's the example I want to use. So I was working with leaders. We were pushing a quality narrative, and we wanted to get leaders focusing more on prevention and also getting information from the front line, because the front line is where things happen, right? That's the first indication that there's some changes on the front line. So you have to be able to listen to the front line. And what was interesting is the leaders that were in my area, they were insistent that they wanted to empower their teams. They were insistent that they told their teams that they're empowered and they want them to exercise some authority, not go into fight or flight. You have to be able to not have a stress response when faced with bad news. Imagine those images or movies, SEAL Team 6, Black Hawk Down, whatever, if you can think about some movies, and in the face of massive threat, they still stay calm. That is the number one priority when you're faced in a major threat, is to maintain your mindfulness so that you don't go into fight or flight. Because when you go into fight or flight, your awareness closes in, your resourcefulness shuts down, and you have fewer options available to you. And small things get magnified. So if you're in fight or flight or heading towards fight or flight, small inconveniences can seem like huge threats. And not only does the size of the peril go up, but the probability in your mind goes up. And next thing you know, you're completely closed in. So hopefully that paints a picture as to why the leader is not just about telling people what to do. It's not just about leading the way you want to be led. We have to lead in such a way that the employees respond and that the employees' needs are also met. And that kicks off the conversation I want to have today. So today is about crafting a fulfilling work environment. In the first segment in Dynamic Leadership, this series, so go back 2 weeks, I talked about human needs. And human needs is an important part of it. So I talked about two different ones, and they work together. So most people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. A subset of that group is familiar with the 6 human needs. And both of those, by the way, are from Maslow. So the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I would say, is consistent with the 6 human needs. And then 20 years after Maslow's hierarchy of needs or so, we have self-determination theory. And the self-determination theory, for me, is my foundation for understanding and applying dynamic leadership, because it gets to the human needs, and meeting the human needs leads to intrinsic motivation. When you think about intrinsic motivation, it's putting dopamine and serotonin working in favor of the organization. To simplify this, what you want to remember is growth and contribution. I mentioned that in the introduction. There's also connection and significance. Those are 2 of the 6 needs, and the other 2 are certainty and variety. Certainty and variety, as you can see, that's sort of a continuum, and people can move back and forth. If they get too much variety, then they have uncertainty, so they move back to certainty. And you get too much certainty, you lack variety, so it's moving back and forth. And the same with connection and significance. You get too much connection, you don't feel significant. You get too much significance, you get promoted and what have you, then you lose the connection. So rather than focus on those 4 needs, we focus on growth and contribution. By growth and contribution, especially if you're engaged, there's enough variety, there's enough connection, there's enough significance, and there's enough uncertainty that keeps things moving around. And it ties in with what I'll talk about a little bit later today, gamification. You look at video games, and not just kids, adults, right? Teenagers, adults, young adults will play video games for hours and hours and hours. It's a big business. There's people who watch the video games, people who play the video games, people travel to be in video game tournaments. And it's a big deal. Why? Because it has all of the elements that are putting the dopamine and serotonin and keeping those neurotransmitters in play. So we're basically continuing to build habits. And there's enough definition, there's enough structure within the video game, but also there's enough autonomy. There's the ability for competence, self-determination theory, and then there's the ability for relatedness, which is why you have people going to watch these games and streaming. They've been streaming games and building up audiences streaming games for over 10 years. Now it's exploding, but this has been around for, I'd say, since 2008, if not before, where people have been streaming and other people watching, building up these YouTube channels, et cetera, going live. The point being, gamification is actually tapping into this thing that I'm talking about. I also use the example of sports teams and using a team metaphor for your organization, as opposed to a family metaphor, as opposed to a political metaphor where you have two camps competing against one another, as opposed to a friend metaphor, which may sound good on paper. When you build a team metaphor and you live into that, everybody can be on the same page and you can live into best practices. So with that as a backdrop, and in thinking about crafting a fulfilling workplace, I just want to paint a picture of what we'll be talking about over the next few months, and to emphasize that this is not only available, it's actually very accessible, but we have to think about it a little bit differently. And it starts with leading the way people want to be led, as opposed to what's comfortable for the leader. The vision is intentional. Everybody gets that you have to have a vision, you have the mission, you have the goals, and one vision, ideally, and everybody should be in the same playbook. Once you have the vision, you can then decide the culture. What's the right culture for this vision? And when I look at an organization, life is very fractal. So the organization is not that different than a single person. We lose sight of that. So if you look at a person's habits, take one person and we say, okay, their habits and their behaviors, that's not who they are. But their habits and behaviors make up their personality. So if you meet somebody, you walk away, the experience, their personality is a result of their habits and behaviors. In an organization, habits and behaviors are like culture. And in my 7 fitness areas framework, which is the roadmap I use to go from where we are to where we want to be. And it's making the shift from have, do, be to be, do, have. And culture, just like the habits, we first want to decide on the be, and then we focus on the have. If you look at an individual, it makes sense. People sometimes focus on what they want, on the have, and that can lead to corruption. It can lead to shortcuts. But when you focus on being, then the have, the do, and the have more easily falls out of that. So we've got to decide on the vision, and then what's the culture that we need? Be intentional here and decide on the culture that's needed in order to achieve that vision. Now, people will say that, and I agree, culture eats strategy for lunch. And it's very difficult to change culture. And leaders will take that as an out and say, well, yeah, you can't change culture, so we have to live with it. 2 things. One is, my audience is small business owners, and small business owners, ideally, before you put in a leadership team, you can have this conversation. And by deciding your culture in advance, you have a lot of say in what you do. This is the intentionality part. Once the culture is established, it's a lot more difficult, and you need the change management, you need the project, but you have to do the reinforcement, and it's almost like a parallel track that's running the organization and also changing the culture, and has to do with selection and deselection and moving people around. But ideally, the better solution is to get it right in the beginning, and then after that we go into the environment. And in the environment, that's where I'm using some of these examples, like the gamification, the sports team metaphor. Imagine having 3 leaders on your team, and one leader has a family metaphor, another leader works out of sort of a political metaphor where they're constantly pitting their people against each other, and the other one is working out of a team metaphor. When those employees are having lunch together and chatting, you can see where the toxicity comes up, because each one of them has a model of the world in terms of the organization. Each one of them has a model. And as they describe with that model, there's going to be conflicts, but people aren't going to go back to the leader and say, "Hey, can you help me work through this conflict?" What they're going to do is they're going to try to match, make it fit. And now you have this hodgepodge of perspectives that can create, first of all, a poor understanding. And then that poor understanding can lead to toxicity, because inputs no longer equal outputs. There's all this noise in between. And once that happens, you can see where motivation goes, especially intrinsic motivation, where it goes away. So vision, decide your vision, and that's your responsibility of the leader. And then you could bring in other people to work through the strategy and refine the vision, but the vision has to be owned by the owner or the top leader. In the case of organizations, you'll see the board owning that vision. But the fewer people involved in creating or crafting that vision, the better, in my opinion. Then you have the culture, and it's pretty straightforward. You know what kind of a culture you need. You can just look at what your targets are, what the competition looks like, and you can decide the culture. And then the environment, we'll just, for now, just think team metaphor versus family metaphor versus political metaphor versus command and control metaphor. Dynamic leadership actually sits on a continuum between command and control and servant leadership. Neither one of those are a panacea. Neither one of those work in all cases. Command and control requires a lot of support and structure. That's in the military. You have that support and structure. You have levers. You have carrot and stick levers that you can pull and push. And then servant leadership lacks some of the consequences that go with poor performance. So you need both, and the team pulls all that together. So dynamic leadership is what I'm using as the ideal leadership style for small businesses. So then you have a framework. And it's a consistent framework. And if you're starting a leadership team and you're not thinking about this, it's very easy to have leaders from different metaphors. If you have an existing leadership team, it's definitely easy to see why you can have leaders from different metaphors, or who bring a different metaphor to the table. By starting with a framework of dynamic leadership, you have something to come back to. And by looking at it between command and control and servant leadership, you recognize that it's fluid, it's flexible. And the other thing I like about this framework is that you don't have to know a lot of information. You don't have to read books about how to do it. It's human nature, and it ties back to what works. Best practices, the principles, these things have been around for centuries. Common sense can be applied, but where the framework comes in, the owner, the board, the leadership team, they are responsible to make sure that they're using principles and best practices. You see, if you're playing a sports team, if you're coaching a sports team, there's a lot of strategies you don't even think about. And one of the great examples, when you look at high school ball versus college ball versus the pros, you see a lot of trick plays in high school ball. You see far fewer trick plays in college ball, and you see almost no trick plays in the pros, because they already know how to deal with it. They've got the speed, they have the capability. So there's only so many plays or strategies that actually work. And by following principles and best practices, you can identify them. I like to use Multipliers is a great book as a foundation, but also Good to Great and Great by Choice. The reason why those books are so good for this is that the amount of research that went into them, there's no question. You don't get into a debate. This is what we're going to do. Why reinvent the wheel when they've looked at hundreds of companies and reams of data? Why reinvent it? Start with where they are. Now, you can tweak it. I'm not saying that that's the end all be all, but why recreate it when it's already telling you which plays work? This is the equivalent in my mind of the pro teams don't use trick plays. We'll get into more of that. This here is where we get into the building blocks as we develop dynamic leadership. and as we provide the tools for owners to put this into place. Then you have engagement. And right now we're in this debate about people going back to the workplace, being they want to be there, 2 or 3 days a week. We want them there 5 days a week. Employees want to work from home, et cetera, et cetera. Different approaches to get engagement. This is where you have principles and best practices. When you have a team, the players don't stop practicing when practice is over. Practice is a place where people come together, but they go home. They have gym time. They're working out. They're doing work on their own. And it can be the same way with an organization, but you have to build it that way so that people have a common vision. There's a culture of that, and they understand the environment. There's a framework for it. And then I think the other part that makes it live and possible is the gamification. I already talked about serotonin and dopamine, how that comes into play, and using some of the game theory and some of the elements that are with gaming, which keeps people involved for hours and hours. I remember a study that they paid kids on the street. They found some kids on the street, and they do the double-blind studies, and they try to work out conflicts, et cetera, to make sure that they're getting real information. And they paid these kids a certain amount per hour, something like $5 an hour, to kick a rock and keep the rock moving. And then they took a similar situation, but they added one thing to this group. The first group, some of the kids left before even being able to collect the money. The second group that they did one little thing. They set up goals on each end and didn't say play a game. They just said keep the rock moving. And the kids came up with their own game. It was similar to soccer, and they played for hours. And that's an example, adding gamification into the thing. It's a kind of a basic example, but it starts to paint a picture. There's another research experiment. It wasn't really an experiment, but some research, and it showed that in concentration camps, there was a particular country that would, to torture the prisoners, would make them dig a hole, and carry the sand and sandbags across the field and fill up a hole over there. And then they would have to empty that hole into the sandbags and bring it back across the field and put it in that one. They would do this all day, and some of the people lost their mind. So this is a point about not asking people to do things that you're not actually going to use. So there are elements there that we know that these things exist. And if you're not careful, organizations will fall into that because it's the shortcuts. This is why be, do, have is so important, and have, do, be leads to these shortcuts, and these shortcuts lead to things like having people fill sandbags for no reason. And then the next one over here, I'll put human needs. I already talked about this a bit with the serotonin and the dopamine examples, but you've got to look at human needs. And going back to self-determination theory, you have autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And the way you can think about this is, are you using autonomy supportive language? And I use the example of the person who's empowering the employee. They may have been using the right language, but it wasn't a growth type of conversation. It was a pass fail. Too many employees walk into the situation thinking everything is pass fail. It's either 100 or you failed. Thinking about a test score or a class, 70% is passing and 100% is the top. But they lose sight of the fact that life is living between this 70 and 100%. Sometimes you drop below. It's a series of trial and error to stay between that 70 and 100. You stay at the 100 too long, and you're probably leaving money on the table, certainly leaving growth and contribution on the table. You stay at 70 too long, and you're probably using some poor strategies. So this is a constant movement back and forth, and it gets to the growth mindset. If you allow your employees to only see pass and fail, you are actually fostering a fixed mindset. So we have autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And in the development plans, we build that out so that those things are being taken care of. And then you have the growth and the contribution. If the person can't see the connection between what they're doing today and either the contribution or the growth, they're going to lose some of that intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is powerful because extrinsic motivation people typically leave money on the table. You see bonus programs and commission programs. Why isn't everybody maxing out on those things? They leave money on the table. Why do they leave money on the table? Because they're getting those needs met somewhere else. The money is actually a lower need in most cases on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have enough money to have shelter and food and maybe go out and dealing with the relatedness need or belonging need. You go out a few times, have some fun, some partying, but then good sales organizations will put in recognition for the esteem needs. And then, I would say you can even go at the top one with self-actualization and have people shoulder to shoulder with the senior leadership team where they can feel like they're actually influencing the future of the organization. But if you only focus on the commission, as I said, people are going to leave money on the table. And how do you get to that? You can get to it by having autonomy supportive language, by having competence supportive language, and by having relatedness supportive language and practices and processes. And then keeping in mind that what really moves people at the end of the day is growth and contribution. There's only so much that person's going to do for money, and then you want to tap into the altruistic elements. I think an important point for small business owners, and if I'm talking to the group that's like under 10, they are facing, and they're growing and scaling, they're facing this need that's going to show up for them to have a leadership team. This should not be a haphazard process. It should not be a seat of the pants. You want to think about back to here, the vision, culture, and environment, and decide where are you going and what's the leadership team that you need, and then putting that leadership team in place one by one. And the thing is, there's always an expense conversation. And so how do you afford, you can't just put the whole leadership team in place, but you can bring in one person who's maybe going to be the future vice president, or maybe you're working through who's going to be the future vice president. I'm just making that title up. But eventually you're going to have that person who's your right-hand man or woman, and they're going to help you build out the rest of the team. But that person needs to be aligned with your vision and culture and the environment that you see, and they have to be aligned on the be, do, have. It doesn't mean they need to think like you do, but they have to have the same direction. You don't want somebody trying to go east and somebody's trying to go west. The other thing is we want to look for multipliers. And there's a book by that title. And what they've done is they looked at different leaders and categorized them into diminishers and multipliers. You do not want diminishers in your organization, but it happens all the time. Why? Because they get results. Diminishers get results because of what I was talking about earlier. They can bully people. They can coerce people. There's different things that they can do. They can use fear. They can use carrot and stick. Many, many options for diminishers that don't really show up until you're going after the big numbers. The reason why Good to Great is such a good model, as is Great by Choice, is because these are companies that far outperformed other like companies and outperformed them for years. And so this definitely draws a line between the multipliers and the diminishers, because the diminishers are not in those companies. So we know what multiplier behavior looks like for a leader, and we know what diminisher behavior looks like for a leader. And you don't want diminishers, you want more multipliers. And imagine having an entire leadership team of all multipliers and a selection and succession plan that brings more multipliers up from the workforce. And then we want to have ongoing development. I advocate for a 2-year development plan for any position. Now, if it's an entry-level employee, there might be a touch point every 2 or 3 months. If it's a senior leader with experience, it might be a touch point every 6 months, or maybe 2 or 3 touch points in the first 8 or 9 months, and then just another touch point in the second year. And the example I would give, you have a team that brings an experienced quarterback. Let's say there's a quarterback who's been you've been playing in the pros for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and they join another team. They still have to learn the plays. They may sit on the bench for a year. They have to learn some of the protocols on the team. They have to understand what the strengths are, what the weaknesses are. So this is the development process. This is why I like to have a 2-year development plan. So you're not just throwing people out there. This is how you can avoid having a mismatch of team metaphor and political metaphor and command and control metaphor and family metaphor. You don't want that mix. You want everybody singing out of the same playbook. And then you got to be able to overcome barriers and resistance. And a lot of times, the barriers and the resistance are not external. There are some, but I would say you don't necessarily overcome regulations. You design your work so that the regulations, it takes the regulations into consideration. But a lot of the barriers and resistance are from inside. If you think about the team metaphor again, that team every weekend they're facing, or whatever it is, they're facing another team that's trying to stop their every play. And they are trying to outscore them. In the workplace, in business, we don't really have somebody who's trying to stop our every play. In most cases, sometimes there are, but in most cases, they're not trying to stop everything, every part of our strategy. They're doing their thing and we're doing our thing. And so a lot of that overcoming, it has to do with what we've got internally. If you understand entropy, without deliberate energy and focus, all systems will decay, lead to decay. Just go down through any neighborhood that's been abandoned and you can see how it's almost like the buildings have, without the energy moving around them, they just decay even faster. And beyond just not being painted, you've got to be able to overcome that and recognize that organizational entropy. And this gets to leadership development and this ongoing thing. You don't just develop the leader and then walk away. Just like that, I was using an example of a quarterback or whatever position, a pitcher in baseball, whatever position it is, they still have to go through training. They're still working on their skills. You never arrive. The moment they start thinking that they've arrived, there's somebody waiting in the wings. And you may think that you can't do this in a workplace. Absolutely you can. You can use simulations. You can do scoring. Put the HR team to work to come up with simulations with scoring associated with it so that they can do games, adding the gamification. And you can see who's going to rise up and become the leaders in the organization by watching how they perform in the simulations. But it's also something else, is practice. Just like teams practice during the week for the weekend games, we have to have ways to practice dealing with those great opportunities. There are going to be a few opportunities that show up, a few crises that show up, and major moves can be made in some of these crisis times. But you want to have a team that's ready for it. You don't want to be figuring it out as you go without any context for what high performance looks like and how the team works together. And then we have to recognize the internal opponent. In the same way that a person who's trying to break through to above the line, they have to go through this period, this barrier, this artificial barrier that consists of their stories and their beliefs and their I don't want power and their fears and their inhibitions and their wrong models of the world. They've got to work through all of that, and it takes time. And even after they get through it, they have to work to stay above there. Once they break through that line, above the line, this is like Good to Great with Jim Collins. He talks about the companies that are going along, and then one of them breaks out. That's the one he would, and breaks out and stays above on that trajectory for 15 years. That was one of the criteria in Good to Great. And then Great by Choice, he took the companies that stayed on that trajectory while others fell off during the 2008 crisis. He looked at the ones that stayed on the trajectory despite that while others were falling off. And that's the criteria in Great by Choice. And when you look at those two books and the principles that come out of them, you can see that there is an internal component and internal opponent involved. So that's quite a bit there. I wanted to paint a picture that, yes, it's available to us, that we can create the culture that we want and have a fulfilling workplace. And there's a process to go through. And while this is what I laid out here is not exactly what I would say fits into the building blocks, but this is the essence. What I spoke about today is the essence of what you'll hear about in the next few months. And I'll take some of them one by one. We can talk about vision. We can talk about culture. We can talk about environment. Each one of those can be one talk. And I'll work through that as flexible. At the end, I want to get through the 5 agreements. And those 5 agreements, the brain is more than 100,000 years old. The point being, we don't have to create or reinvent the wheel or come up with new ideas. We can focus on what works. People spend more than half their waking hours at work in the organization, so it makes sense that we create a fulfilling workplace, that people are going to get their needs met, either with or without the organization's alignment, either with or without alignment to the organization. And that's a big part of it. Self-determination theory, 6 human needs are a good place to start there. And then there's leadership protocols, and that gets into the how. So a lot of this, what I'm talking about, will fit into the leadership protocols, which feeds the leadership development. And then the last is that you need both project excellence and operational excellence. Too many organizations concentrate on one or the other. It's like we dance with who brung us, but we need both. You can't deal with a VUCA environment and not have both, because once you're above the line, that trajectory is a series of projects to create new capabilities, operational excellence followed by another shift in capabilities, followed by operational excellence, another shift in capabilities, followed by operational excellence. And as I said, it's fractal. But you can't rely just on projects, and you can't rely just on operational excellence. And that also gets into the leadership development plan. So there you go. Tune in next week, Friday morning, and we'll go into talk a little bit about the human needs again, and start getting into the leadership protocols, how that's going to look. And then we'll start tackling this list of elements.